The blood on the envelope had dried to rust by the time it reached Cutter's Ridge. Inside was a wedding certificate and a woman nobody wanted to claim. Sarah Milliken stepped off the stagecoach with her hands wrapped in strips of yellowed linen, the kind that had been washed too many times to stay white. The driver set down her single carpet bag without meeting her eyes, and the horses kicked up enough dust to hide the way she swayed on her feet. She'd been traveling for 3 weeks with fingers that wouldn't close right anymore, sleeping in way stations where men asked questions she wouldn't answer. The town looked like every other she'd passed through, wooden storefronts leaning into each other, a church with paint peeling off in long curls, horses tied to rails that had gone grey in the sun. A dog scratched itself near the livery. Somewhere, a hammer rang against an anvil, the sound lonely in the afternoon heat. She had an address written on paper she kept folded in her boot. The man who'd answered her letter called himself Thomas Garrick, and he'd sent $40 for the journey. She'd used $38 of it, kept $2 hidden in the lining of her bag, and told herself she'd made a choice. Women didn't get many of those. The house sat 2 miles outside town, accessible by a road rutted deep from wagon wheels. Sarah walked it because there was no one to ask for a ride, and because the pain in her hands was easier to manage when she was moving. The sun pressed down on her shoulders. Her boots had worn through on the left side, and every step sent a jolt up her leg that mixed with the constant ache in her palms. She saw the ranch before she reached it, a main house with a porch that sagged in the middle, a barn missing half its roof, corrals empty except for 3 horses that looked like they'd been forgotten. No smoke from the chimney, no laundry hanging, no signs of a woman's work anywhere. Thomas Garrick met her at the door with a bottle in his hand and eyes that traveled over her like she was livestock. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with the kind of face that might have been handsome before drink and meanness had settled into it. "You, Sarah?" "Yes, sir." "Hands out." She hesitated, then unwrapped the linen slowly. Her fingers were swollen at the knuckles, bent at angles that weren't natural. 3 of them wouldn't straighten at all. The skin across her palms had healed in thick ridges of scar tissue that pulled tight when she tried to flex. He made a sound in his throat. "Letter didn't say you were broken." "I can work." "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Can you clean?" "Yes." "Can you do what a wife's meant to do?" She kept her eyes on his boots. "Yes, sir." He stepped back and gestured her inside. The house smelled like old smoke and unwashed clothes. Dishes were piled in a basin, furniture covered in dust, floor tracked with dried mud. A single room served as kitchen and living space, with a bedroom door hanging open to show an unmade bed. No curtains on the windows, no rugs, nothing soft anywhere. "You'll sleep there." He pointed to a corner where a blanket had been wadded up against the wall. "I don't share my bed until a woman's earned it." Sarah nodded. She'd expected worse. "Supper by 6. I want coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and keep those hands hidden. Sight of them makes my stomach turn." He left without another word, and Sarah stood in the middle of the room listening to his boots fade toward the barn. Then she set down her bag, rewrapped her hands, and started looking for something to cook. The trouble started 3 days later when she heard the crying. It came after midnight, thin and distant, carried on wind that rattled the window frames. Sarah had been lying on her blanket staring at cracks in the ceiling because Thomas Garrick snored loud enough to shake the bedroom door, and sleep wasn't something her body remembered how to do properly. The crying rose and fell like a sick animal, except it sounded too human for that. She got up and pressed her ear to the wall. Nothing. Then she eased open the front door and stepped onto the porch. The night air was cold enough to raise bumps on her arms. Stars scattered across the sky in a wash of white that gave just enough light to see by. The crying was coming from somewhere past the barn. She was sure of it now. She wrapped her shawl tighter and walked barefoot across the yard, wincing at every stick and stone that bit into her feet. The barn doors were closed but not latched. She slipped inside to darkness that smelled like old hay and horse droppings. The crying was louder here, muffled but close. She felt her way along the wall until her foot hit something that gave a little, wood planks, a trap door. It took both hands and all her strength to lift it, the pain shooting up her arms in ways that made her vision blur. Below was a root cellar, shallow and cramped, maybe 6 feet deep. Enough moonlight filtered through gaps in the barn walls to show what was inside. 2 children, a boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 4. They were huddled together on a dirt floor, dressed in clothes so filthy they looked like they'd grown there. The girl was crying. The boy had his arms around her, trying to keep her quiet. Sarah's throat closed up. Jesus Christ. The boy looked up at her with eyes that were too old for his face. Please don't tell him we made noise. She climbed down without thinking, her feet finding holds in the earthen wall. The space was barely tall enough to stand in. There was a bucket in one corner, a tin cup, a single blanket that looked like it had started life as a feed sack, nothing else. Who put you here? The boy didn't answer. The girl had stopped crying and was staring at Sarah's wrapped hands. How long have you been down here? I don't know, his voice was hoarse. A while. Sarah's mind raced. She thought of Thomas Garrick passed out drunk in his bed, the way he'd looked at her broken fingers, the house that had no sign of children anywhere. Where's your mother? Gone. Gone where? Just gone, the boy's jaw tightened. He said she ran off and left us, said we weren't worth the trouble of keeping. The girl started crying again, quiet little hiccups that shook her whole body. Sarah knelt down and pulled them both against her, ignoring the way it made her hands scream. They smelled like fear and filth and something else, the particular odor of children who'd been forgotten. I'm getting you out of here, she whispered. He'll kill us if we leave. He'll have to kill me first. She didn't know if that was a promise she could keep, but she climbed back up and started looking for something to feed them. The barn had nothing. The house would wake Thomas if she wasn't careful. She slipped inside anyway, moving through the dark like a ghost, and found bread in a tin and half a jar of preserves. She brought it back with water from the pump, lowering everything down in her skirt, while the children watched her with the kind of desperate hope that broke something in her chest. Eat slow, she told them. Don't make yourselves sick. The boy, his name was Jacob, he finally said, tore into the bread like he was afraid it would vanish. His sister Mary ate more carefully, taking small bites and chewing each one like it was precious. Sarah watched them and felt rage building in her belly, the kind that made her hands shake for reasons that had nothing to do with old injuries. I'll come back tomorrow night, she said. I'll bring more food, and I'll figure out how to get you somewhere safe. There's nowhere safe, Jacob said. Not from him. But Sarah was already climbing out, already planning. She'd survived worse than Thomas Garrick. She'd survived a husband who'd broken her hands with a mallet when she'd burned his dinner, who'd left her bleeding in a barn while he went to town for more whiskey. She'd survived walking away from that with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter she'd written to a stranger. She could survive this too. The problem was surviving wasn't enough anymore. Dawn came up orange and hostile, the kind of light that made everything look harder than it was. Sarah cooked breakfast with her bandaged hands, fumbling over the skillet, watching Thomas Garrick eat without looking at her. He shoveled food into his mouth like he was angry at it, washing everything down with coffee that was 3 parts grounds. You keep to the house today, he said around a mouthful of eggs. I've got business in town, don't need you wandering where you shouldn't. Yes, sir. He left an hour later, riding the best of the 3 horses and carrying a rifle across his saddle. Sarah watched from the window until he was a speck on the horizon, then she ran to the barn. The children were awake, pressed together in their hole like animals waiting to be slaughtered. She fed them what she'd been able to hide, biscuits and bacon, a tin of peaches she'd found in the back of a cupboard. They ate without talking, and she tried not to stare at how thin they were, how Mary's collarbone stuck out like a piece of driftwood. Tell me about your mother, Sarah said. Jacob looked at her with something like suspicion. Why? Because I need to know what happened. He was quiet for a long time, picking at the edge of his shirt. Then he said, she was nice. She used to sing to us. She came out here to marry him because she didn't have anywhere else to go, same as you, I guess. Sarah felt something twist in her gut. He was mean to her, Jacob continued. Wouldn't let her go to town, wouldn't let her write letters. One day she tried to take us and leave, and he caught us before we made it to the road. Beat her so bad she couldn't walk right. Then he locked us down here and told her if we made any noise, he'd shoot us. And she left anyway. I don't know, Jacob's voice cracked. One morning he came out and said she was gone, said she'd run off in the night and we were his problem now. He put us down here and said if we died it would save him the trouble. Mary started crying again, and Sarah gathered her up, even though it sent fire through her damaged nerves. The girl weighed almost nothing. Listen to me, Sarah said, looking at both of them. I'm going to get you out. I don't know how yet, but I will. You have to trust me. Why would you help us? Jacob asked. You don't even know us. Because nobody helped me, Sarah wanted to say. Because I know what it's like to be forgotten. Because there's something in this world that has to be worth more than just surviving. Instead, she said, because it's the right thing to do. She spent the rest of the day trying to think. Running wasn't an option. She had no money, no horse, no way to get 2 children across open country without being caught. Going to the sheriff might work if the sheriff was honest, but she'd met enough lawmen to know that was a gamble. Some of them believed women. Most of them believed men. The answer came to her near sunset, when she was standing on the porch watching the road. There was another ranch about 3 miles west, just visible as a dark shape against the hills. She'd seen smoke from its chimney, seen cattle in its pastures. Someone lived there, someone who might have a conscience. That night, after Thomas had drunk himself into his usual stupor, Sarah slipped out again. She went to the cellar and told the children she'd be gone for a while, that they needed to stay quiet no matter what. Then she started walking. The moon was 3/4 full, bright enough to cast shadows. Her feet found the path by memory and stubbornness, and the pain in her hands faded into background noise. She was cold and scared and more determined than she'd been in years. The ranch house appeared out of the darkness like something from a dream, 2 stories, painted white, with a porch that wrapped around the front and windows that glowed with lamplight. Smoke curled from the chimney. A dog barked when she approached, and a moment later the front door opened. A man stood silhouetted against the light, tall, broad-shouldered, holding a rifle that wasn't quite pointed at her. Help you with something? His voice was careful, not friendly but not hostile either. Sarah's words came out in a rush. I need help. There are children. He's keeping them in a root cellar. They haven't eaten in days, except what I've been sneaking them. Slow down. He stepped onto the porch, lowering the rifle. Who's keeping children in a cellar? Thomas Garrick, I'm his. She couldn't say wife. The word stuck in her throat. I came here 3 days ago. I found them last night. They're starving. He said their mother ran off and left them. The man was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he said, come inside. His name was Daniel Rourke, and his kitchen was warm in a way that made Sarah want to cry. He sat her down at a table that had been built by someone who cared about things being level, poured her coffee that actually tasted like coffee, and listened while she told him everything. About the letter, about Thomas, about the children locked underground like they were already dead. When she finished, he was staring at her bandaged hands. He do that to you? No, different mans. Daniel's jaw worked. How old are these kids? Young, 6 and 4 maybe. And they've been down there, how long? The boy said he doesn't know. Weeks, maybe longer. Daniel stood up and paced to the window, his hands curling into fists. He was younger than Thomas, maybe early 30s, with the kind of face that looked like it smiled easy but wasn't smiling now. When he turned back, his eyes were hard. I'll ride to town tomorrow, talk to Sheriff Brennan. Garrick's got a reputation, but this, he shook his head. This is something else. What if the sheriff doesn't believe you? He'll believe me, I know Brennan. He's not perfect, but he's not in Garrick's pocket either. Daniel sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Question is, what happens to you when Garrick figures out you talked? Sarah hadn't let herself think about that. I'll handle it. You'll handle it, he said it flat, like he was tasting the words, with broken hands and nowhere to go. I didn't come here for me. I know, but that doesn't mean you don't matter. Something in Sarah's chest cracked open at that. She looked down at her coffee, blinking hard, and Daniel had the grace to pretend he didn't notice. Stay here tonight, he said. I've got a spare room upstairs. Tomorrow morning I'll ride to town, and then we'll figure out what comes next. I can't leave them alone that long. You can't help them if you're dead, either. He had a point, but Sarah couldn't make herself accept it. She stood up, swaying a little from exhaustion and hunger she'd been ignoring. I have to go back, if he wakes up and I'm gone. Then I'll ride with you. Daniel was already moving toward the door. Make sure you get there safe, and tomorrow, first light, I'm getting the sheriff. They rode double on his horse, Sarah holding onto his waist and trying not to think about how long it had been since she'd been close to someone who didn't want to hurt her. The ranch appeared out of the darkness, quiet and still. Daniel left her at the edge of the property, watching until she'd slipped inside before he turned and rode away. Thomas was still snoring. Sarah lay down on her blanket and stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, and tried to believe that morning would bring something better than more survival. The sheriff came at noon with Daniel beside him and 2 deputies trailing behind. Thomas was in the yard working on a fence that didn't need fixing, and he looked up when they rode in with an expression that went from surprise to angry in the space of a heartbeat. Help you, gentlemen. Sheriff Brennan was an older man, weathered like fence posts, with eyes that had seen enough to make judgment calls. Got a report you're keeping children locked up on your property. Mind if we take a look around? Report from who? That's not your concern. Thomas's gaze flicked to the house, where Sarah stood in the doorway with her heart hammering. His face darkened. That bitch has been telling lies. Then you won't mind us checking the barn. It took them less than 5 minutes to find the cellar. Sarah watched from the porch as they brought Jacob and Mary up into the sunlight, the children squinting and clinging to each other while the deputies stared at them with expressions that ranged from shock to fury. Daniel climbed down and came back up with the bucket, the cup, the filthy blanket, carrying them like evidence at a trial. Sheriff Brennan turned to Thomas with his hand on his pistol. Want to explain this? They're mine to deal with however I see fit. They're children, not livestock. Their mother left them. What was I supposed to do? Feed them for one thing. Brennan's voice was cold enough to frost glass. Keep them somewhere that isn't a hole in the ground for another. Thomas Garrick, you're under arrest for child endangerment and criminal cruelty. Thomas lunged for the sheriff and got a rifle butt to the stomach for his trouble. He went down hard, gasping, and the deputies hauled him up with his hands behind his back. He was screaming about his rights, about property, about how Sarah was just a whore he'd paid for, and she'd been the one who wanted the kids gone. That true? Brennan asked Sarah. No, sir. Didn't think so. He tipped his hat to her. You'll need to come to town, give a statement, you and those children. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched them load Thomas into a wagon like cargo, still shouting, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in years. Daniel was kneeling next to the children, talking to them in a voice too low for Sarah to hear. When he stood up and walked over to her, his expression was complicated. I'll take you to town, he said. All of you get what you need from the house. I don't have anything to get. Then we'll go now. The trial was fast by frontier standards, 2 weeks from arrest to verdict. The whole town showed up to watch Thomas Garrick stand in front of a judge and try to explain why 2 children had been found living in conditions fit for dying dogs. The prosecutor brought in Sarah, brought in Jacob, brought in a doctor who examined Mary and reported that she was severely malnourished and likely wouldn't have lasted another month. Thomas's lawyer tried to argue that he'd been overwhelmed, that the mother had abandoned her responsibilities, that he'd done his best under difficult circumstances. The jury took 40 minutes to find him guilty. The judge gave him 10 years in territorial prison and banned him from owning property in the county. Sarah watched from the back of the courtroom with her hands in her lap, and when the verdict came down, she didn't feel victorious. She just felt tired. The question of what happened to the children got answered 3 days later, when Daniel rode up to the boarding house where Sarah was staying with money she didn't have and knocked on her door. "Got a proposition for you," he said when she answered. They were standing in a hallway that smelled like cabbage and lamp oil, and Sarah's first thought was that he'd come to tell her she needed to leave town. Instead, he said, "Those kids need someone to look after them. Court's trying to figure out if they've got family anywhere, but it's not looking likely. And even if they do, might not be safe to send them back." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've got a ranch that could use a woman's hand. Big house, plenty of room, good land. I'm not," he stopped, choosing words carefully. "I'm not talking about what Garrick was doing. I'm talking about a job, housekeeper if you want, cook, someone to help with those kids until we figure out what's best for them." Sarah stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've been watching you for 2 weeks, and you're about the toughest person I've ever met, and because those kids trust you, and because," he looked away, jaw working, "because there ought to be more to life than just making it through the day." "I can't pay you back. Didn't ask you to." Sarah's hands were throbbing, the way they did when weather was changing or when she'd been holding them still too long. She flexed her fingers as much as she could, feeling scar tissue pull, and thought about that night walking across empty land toward a stranger's house. About the way Daniel had listened without judging. About the look on his face when they'd brought the children up from the dark. What happens when you decide you don't want a broken woman working for you? What happens when you decide you don't want to work for a stubborn rancher? Despite everything, Sarah almost smiled. "I'll think about it." "Fair enough." He left, and Sarah went to the window to watch him ride away. Behind her, in the room she was sharing with Jacob and Mary, the children were playing with a set of wooden horses someone had donated. Their voices were small and uncertain, but they were learning to laugh again. She thought about broken hands and mail-order brides and all the ways women got forgotten on the frontier. She thought about her life before Thomas Garrick and the life she'd had with him and the life that was waiting if she was brave enough to reach for it. The next morning, she packed her bag and walked with the children to Daniel's ranch. He met them on the porch with coffee and breakfast and a smile that looked like it had been waiting for them. "House is yours to organize however makes sense," he told Sarah. "Kids can take the 2 rooms upstairs. I'll stay on the ground floor." "You don't have to." "I know, but I'm doing it anyway." They settled into a routine that felt almost like normal. Sarah cooked and cleaned, her hands slowly learning to work around their limitations. Jacob and Mary started eating like regular children, started talking without flinching, started asking questions about horses and cattle and what came after winter. Daniel was patient with them in ways that suggested he'd been a different person once, before loneliness had worn him down to essentials. At night, after the children were asleep, Sarah and Daniel would sit on the porch drinking coffee and talking about nothing important, about weather and crops and neighbors, about the way the stars looked different depending on the season, about everything except the things that mattered most. It was 6 weeks before Sarah unwrapped her hands in front of him. They were fixing a fence together, her holding boards while he hammered, and she'd been struggling to grip the wood. Finally, she just pulled the bandages off and set them aside, exposing the twisted fingers and scarred palms. Daniel stopped mid-swing and looked at her, really looked, taking in every broken piece. "That hurt. All the time. Can you use them?" "Enough." He went back to hammering, and Sarah felt something settle in her chest. No questions about what happened, no disgust, just acceptance, simple and clean as water. "I was thinking," Daniel said, driving a nail home, "those kids are going to need schooling. Town's got a teacher comes through every couple months. Might be we could work something out." "Might be." "And Sarah." She looked at him. "I know this started as a job, but if you wanted to stay on permanent as part of the place, he gestured vaguely at the ranch, at the house, at everything, I'd be glad of it, not as a worker, as a partner, if that was something you could see yourself wanting. Sarah's throat closed up. You asking me to marry you? Eventually, maybe, if you'd have me. Right now I'm just asking if you'd stay. She thought about all the ways women survived on the frontier, about the letters they wrote to strangers and the promises they made to men they'd never met, about the difference between surviving and living. I'll stay, she said. Daniel smiled, and it was like watching sun break through clouds. The news spread through Cutter's Ridge the way frontier news always did, fast and thorough as wildfire. People talked about the mail-order bride who'd found children buried alive, about the rancher who'd helped her get justice, about how the two of them had taken in Jacob and Mary and given them something like a family. Some folks said it was romantic, others said it was practical, most just said it was the kind of thing that reminded you there was still good in the world, even when everything else seemed determined to prove otherwise. Sarah didn't care what they said. She was too busy learning how to live again, in a house that felt like home, with children who called her name when they were scared, and a man who looked at her broken hands and saw strength instead of ruin. Spring came to the high country with a vengeance, bringing flowers and green grass and mud that made the roads impassable. Daniel and Sarah stood on the porch one evening watching the sun set over hills that rolled away to forever, and he reached over and took her hand, the scarred one, the one that wouldn't close right, and held it like it was valuable. Thank you, he said. For what? For being brave enough to walk across that field in the dark, for trusting me when you had no reason to, for staying. Sarah looked at their joined hands, at the way his fingers curved around hers despite the awkward angles. Thank you for listening. Inside the house, Mary was laughing at something Jacob had said, and the sound carried through the open windows like a promise that good things were possible after all. The story of what happened at Thomas Garrick's ranch did shake the West, in its own quiet way, not because it was the only time a woman had been mistreated or the only time children had suffered, but because one person had decided not to look away, because she'd chosen to save them even when she couldn't save herself, because in a world that often forgot about women and children, someone had remembered. And sometimes, on the frontier where life was hard and short and brutal, that was enough to change everything.